The history of the 1876 plot to steal Abraham Lincoln's body begins not with the conspiracy itself, but with the profound and complex legacy of his death. When Abraham Lincoln died on April 15, 1865, the United States was a nation fractured by 4 years of civil war yet momentarily united in a paroxysm of grief. The journey of his remains from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, was not merely a logistical transport. It was a consecration of the American landscape. The funeral train, draped in mourning black, traveled 1,600 miles over the course of 2 weeks. It passed through major cities and small towns, where millions of Americans stood in silence to witness the passage of the Great Emancipator. This journey established the physical remains of Lincoln as a sacred relic of the Union, a tangible connection to the sacrifice required to preserve the nation. By the time the train arrived in Springfield on May 3, 1865, the body had transcended its biological reality to become a symbol of national integrity. However, the question of where this sacred relic would rest became a source of immediate contention. The National Lincoln Monument Association, formed by Springfield's civic elite, initially planned a grand tomb in the center of the city, envisioning it as a convenient hub for commerce and tourism. Mary Todd Lincoln, the president's widow, adamantly opposed this. She recalled her husband's desire for a quiet resting place and threatened to remove his remains to the crypt in the U.S. Capitol if her wishes were not respected. The association capitulated, and Oak Ridge Cemetery, a rural wooded landscape 2 miles north of the city center, was selected. This decision, driven by a desire for tranquility, inadvertently created the isolation that would later make the tomb vulnerable to criminal enterprise. The Lincoln Tomb, designed by Larkin Goldsmith Mead and dedicated in 1874, was a masterpiece of 19th-century monumental architecture. Constructed of Massachusetts granite, it featured a 117-foot obelisk and elaborate bronze statuary depicting the infantry, cavalry, artillery, and navy. Yet, beneath its imposing exterior lay significant security flaws that were characteristic of an era that had not yet conceived of the heist as a modern phenomenon. The interior of the monument was divided into 2 primary sections: the Memorial Hall, a small museum on the south side, and the catacomb, the burial chamber on the north side. These 2 spaces were separated by the solid mass of the obelisk's foundation, meaning there was no direct internal access between the custodian station and the president's body. To check on the remains, one had to exit the Memorial Hall, walk around the exterior terrace, and enter the catacomb from the outside. The sarcophagus itself stood in the center of the semicircular catacomb. It was a white marble receptacle, not cemented to the floor, and the lid was sealed only with plaster, not the heavy cement that would be used in later eras. The association had built a shrine for pilgrims, assuming that the reverence for Lincoln would be sufficient protection. They failed to account for the audacity of profit-driven criminality. The man charged with protecting this site was John Carroll Power, appointed custodian in October 1874. Power was a man of intense, almost obsessive dedication. Born in 1819, he was an amateur historian and genealogist who viewed his position as a high spiritual calling. He lived in a small, damp room within the monument's labyrinthine basement structure, enduring the cold and the gloom to be near his charge. Power's daily routine involved greeting the thousands of visitors who came to pay their respects, charging them 25 cents for admission to the Memorial Hall, though the catacomb view was free, and selling souvenirs to fund the tomb's maintenance. Despite his devotion, Power was not a security professional. He was an elderly scholar, armed only with his indignation and, later, a revolver he barely knew how to use. He frequently expressed concern about the safety of the remains, writing of his fears that designing men might one day target the tomb. His warnings were largely dismissed by the Monument Association as the anxieties of an eccentric. In 1876, Power was the only line of defense between the body of the president and the outside world. The year 1876 was a crucible for the United States. It was the centennial of the Declaration of Independence, a time of national celebration, but also a time of deep uncertainty. The economic panic of 1873 had plunged the nation into a depression, fueling the rise of organized criminal gangs and counterfeiting rings. The Reconstruction era was collapsing, and the presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden was shaping up to be the most contested and corrupt in history. In this atmosphere of cynicism and economic desperation, the sacredness of Lincoln became a commodity. To the counterfeiting rings of the Midwest, the president's body represented not a martyr, but an asset, a high-value object that could be exchanged for the freedom of their most valuable technician. The plot that formed in the autumn of 1876 was a direct product of this specific historical moment, where the reverence of the past collided with the ruthless pragmatism of the Gilded Age. The date chosen for the crime was November 7, 1876, Election Day. It was a tactical masterstroke. The entire nation, and specifically the city of Springfield, was distracted. The populace was fixated on the returns of the Hayes-Tilden election, which were expected to be razor-thin. Crowds gathered at telegraph offices and newspaper headquarters. The police were deployed to polling stations and political rallies to suppress brawls. The cemetery, dark and silent, was the last place anyone was looking. The weather favored the conspirators. It was a cloudy, moonless night, plunging Oak Ridge into an abyssal blackness. Around 6:40 p.m., 3 men approached the tomb from the shadows of the surrounding oak trees. They were Jack Hughes, Terrence Mullen, and Lewis Swegles. They carried a burlap sack containing their tools, a saw, a file, and a crowbar. They had arrived in Springfield earlier that morning by train from Chicago, blending in with the political travelers. During the day, in a display of breathtaking arrogance, they had taken a tour of the tomb. Their guide was none other than John Carroll Power, who, unbeknownst to them, was already aware of the plot and was playing the part of the unsuspecting host. Power had shown them the strength of the gates and the position of the sarcophagus, information they now used as they approached the structure in the dark. The men reached the iron gate of the catacomb. It was locked with a heavy padlock, but it was a standard mechanism, vulnerable to simple tools. Mullen, the smaller and more aggressive of the two leaders, took the file from the sack. The sound of metal rasping on metal, scritch, 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 seemed deafening in the silence of the cemetery. It was a slow process, fueled by nervous adrenaline. Every rustle of the wind in the dead leaves sounded like a footstep. Finally, the lock gave way. The shackle snapped and the gate groaned open. They stepped inside the burial chamber. The air was cool and smelled of damp stone and the decay of old floral tributes. In the center of the room, the white marble sarcophagus glowed faintly in the light of their dark lantern, a shuttered device that allowed only a sliver of light to escape. Inside the marble sarcophagus lay the red cedar coffin of Abraham Lincoln, and within that, a lead lining that sealed the body. The objective was to remove the cedar coffin entirely. The men wedged their crowbar beneath the heavy marble lid of the sarcophagus. With grunts of exertion, they pried it upward. They did not need to remove it completely, they only needed to slide it back enough to access the coffin. The marble was heavy, scraping loudly against the stone base as they shoved it aside. Next, they attacked the marble panel at the foot of the sarcophagus. They cut through the adhesive and removed the panel, creating an opening through which they intended to slide the coffin out lengthwise. Hughes and Mullen grabbed the handles of the coffin. They pulled. It barely moved. The lead lining made the coffin immensely heavy, approximately 500 pounds of dead weight. They strained against the burden, their boots slipping on the stone floor. Slowly, agonizingly, the coffin began to slide. They managed to pull it out about 18 inches, leaving it hanging precariously out of the sarcophagus. "It's too heavy," Mullen whispered, breathless. "We can't carry this to the wagon ourselves." They needed the vehicle immediately. The original plan had been to carry the coffin to the wagon waiting outside the grounds, but the weight made that impossible. They needed to bring the wagon to the tomb entrance. Mullen turned to Swegles. "Go get the wagon," he ordered. "Bring it up here. We're ready." Swegles nodded and slipped out of the catacomb, disappearing into the black void of the cemetery grounds. Hughes and Mullen remained in the crypt, standing in the dark with the half-extracted body of the president, waiting for their escape vehicle. Outside, Lewis Swegles walked away from the tomb, but he did not head toward any wagon. He stopped a short distance away, shielded by the darkness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a match. He struck it against his boot. The flame flared up, a tiny beacon of orange light in the overwhelming darkness. Inside the memorial hall, separated from the catacomb by the thick foundation wall, a group of men saw the signal through the window. Patrick Tyrrell, chief of the Chicago Secret Service, tightened his grip on his revolver. Beside him, huddled in the cold, were his agents and hired Pinkerton detectives. They had been waiting for hours, stocking-footed to reduce noise, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. "That's the signal," Tyrrell whispered. "Go." The lawmen burst from the memorial hall. They rushed around the exterior terrace, their socks slipping on the cold stone, weapons drawn. They were seconds away from catching the thieves red-handed. They rounded the corner toward the catacomb entrance, ready to spring the trap. Suddenly, a deafening crack shattered the silence. A flash of gunfire illuminated the stone pillars of the monument. George Hay, a Pinkerton detective, had tripped in the dark. His revolver, cocked and ready, discharged accidentally. The bullet ricocheted wildly into the night, the sound ringing out like a cannon blast. The element of surprise was annihilated. To understand the audacity of the plot to steal Lincoln's body, one must pivot from the sacred atmosphere of the tomb to the industrial underbelly of 19th-century counterfeiting. The crime was not political. It was strictly business. In the 1870s, counterfeiting was a massive cottage industry in the Midwest, driven by the legacy of the Civil War. During the war, the federal government had introduced the greenback, a standardized paper currency to finance the Union effort. While this stabilized the economy, it also created a golden opportunity for criminals. For the first time, a single set of engraved plates could produce money that was accepted in every state. By 1865, it was estimated that nearly half of the paper money in circulation was fake. The Coney Men, a slang term for counterfeiters derived from coney, meaning a rabbit or dupe, operated in sophisticated networks. At the heart of the 1876 plot was a man who wasn't even in Springfield, Benjamin Boyd. Boyd was a master engraver, considered one of the finest letterers on steel in the world. His work was so precise that his counterfeit $50 bills were virtually indistinguishable from genuine currency. Boyd was the technical engine of a massive ring run by James Big Jim Kennally. Based in St. Louis and Chicago, Kennaly's empire flooded the Midwest with Boyd's high-quality notes. However, the United States Secret Service, established in 1865 specifically to combat this threat, had been hunting Boyd for years. In October 1875, Patrick Tyrrell, the rising star of the Secret Service, finally caught Boyd. Acting on information from Boyd's former mentor, Nat Kinsey, Tyrrell raided Boyd's workshop in Fulton, Illinois. Boyd was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in the Illinois State Penitentiary at Joliet. Boyd's imprisonment was a catastrophe for Big Jim Kennally. Without Boyd, there were no new plates. The quality of the gang's currency plummeted, and shovers began getting caught with inferior bills. Kennally faced a supply chain crisis that threatened to destroy his organization. He needed Boyd back. A legal appeal was impossible. The evidence was ironclad. A prison break was too risky and would leave Boyd as a hunted fugitive, unable to work. Kennally needed a pardon. He needed the government to release Boyd voluntarily. It was in this climate of desperation that the Ransom plot was conceived. Kennally reasoned that the government valued the memory of Abraham Lincoln more than it valued the incarceration of one counterfeiter. If he could secure the president's body, he could dictate terms. The demands were formulated. Full pardon for Benjamin Boyd, $200,000 in cash, approximately $5.5 million today. The plan included burying the body in the sand dunes of Indiana, a desolate, shifting landscape where the tracks would be covered by the wind, making the location impossible to find without the gang's cooperation. It was a cold, transactional calculation, a dead president for a living engraver. The conspiracy coalesced in Chicago, specifically at a location known as The Hub on West Madison Street. Owned by Terrence Mullen, a member of Kenneally's gang, The Hub served as the operational headquarters for the ring. It was a dim, dusty establishment where counterfeiters gathered to exchange news and purchase boodle. In a supreme irony, a plaster bust of Abraham Lincoln stood on a shelf overlooking the room, silently watching the men who planned to disturb his grave. Kennally delegated the operation to two of his underlings. Terrence Mullen, the proprietor of The Hub, a small, wiry man with a volatile temper. Jack Hughes, a shover of counterfeit currency, larger, quieter, but not particularly bright. Neither man had experience with grave robbing. They needed a specialist, a ghoul who knew how to handle a corpse and manage the logistics of a disinterment. And enter Lewis Swegles. To the gang at The Hub, Swegles was a career criminal, a horse thief who boasted of his experience as the boss body snatcher of Chicago. He claimed to have supplied medical schools with cadavers and knew the trade inside out. Mullen and Hughes took the bait. They recruited Swegles into the inner circle, revealing the details of the Lincoln plot. They needed him to manage the physical extraction and the transport wagon. But Lewis Swegles was not a body snatcher. He was a roper, the 19th century term for a confidential informant. Swegles was on the payroll of Patrick Tyrrell and the Secret Service. He had been sent to The Hub to gather intelligence on the circulation of fake currency, but he had stumbled upon the crime of the century. Swegles immediately reported the plot to Tyrrell. "They are going to steal Lincoln," he told the chief. Tyrrell was initially skeptical, finding the idea too grotesque to be believed, but Swegles provided specific details: the ransom amount, the location of the burial, Indiana Dunes, and the motivation, Boyd's release. Tyrrell faced a dilemma. Grave robbing itself was not a felony in Illinois at the time, a legal oversight that would become relevant later. If he arrested them for conspiracy, they might get off with a light sentence or be acquitted. He needed to catch them in the act, literally with their hands on the coffin, to ensure a conviction that would dismantle the gang. He ordered Swegles to play along. Swegles became the third man in the plot, feeding Mullen and Hughes ideas while relaying every schedule change to Tyrrell. He met with them nightly at The Hub, refining the plan. The gang purchased a copy of an English newspaper, the Catholic Union and Times, to leave in the tomb. Their bizarre logic was that this foreign paper would confuse the police or serve as a code to prove they were the true kidnappers when the ransom note was sent. The date was set for November 7th. Tyrrell contacted Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's surviving son, to inform him of the threat. Robert, though, horrified, gave his consent for the operation, trusting Tyrrell to protect his father's remains. On the evening of November 6, 1876, a train chugged out of Chicago bound for Springfield. In the smoking car sat Hughes, Mullen, and Swegles. They carried no luggage, only their tools wrapped in simple coverings. They discussed the logistics of the heist, oblivious to the other passengers. Just a few cars away, on the very same train, sat Patrick Tyrrell and his team. The proximity was dangerous. A chance encounter in the dining car or on the platform could have blown the entire operation. Tyrrell kept his men hidden, watching the conspirators from a distance as the train rolled through the Illinois prairie. Upon arriving in Springfield on the morning of November 7th, the thieves checked into a hotel under false names. Their first move was to scout the target. They walked to Oak Ridge Cemetery and requested a tour. John Carroll Power, the custodian, had been briefed by Tyrrell. He was instructed to act normally. In a scene of dramatic irony, Power led the very men who planned to assault him through the tomb. He unlocked the gates, showed them the sarcophagus, and explained the layout. Hughes and Mullen asked questions about the weight of the coffin and the security of the doors. Power answered them truthfully, playing the role of the naive guardian while mentally noting their every glance. As night fell, Tyrrell mobilized his strike team. It consisted of Secret Service agents, hired Pinkerton detectives, including George Hay, and the custodian Power. They entered the memorial hall on the south side of the monument. The plan was simple. Hide in the memorial hall. Wait for the thieves to enter the catacomb on the north side. Wait for Swegles' signal, the match. Surround the catacomb and arrest them with the coffin in hand. The waiting began around 6:00 p.m. The memorial hall was unheated, damp, and pitch black. The lawmen removed their boots to ensure silence, standing in their stocking feet on the freezing stone floor. The psychological strain was immense. For hours they stood in the dark, unable to speak or smoke. The sounds of the election night revelry drifted from the city, distant cheers, firecrackers, but at the cemetery there was only the wind. Then they heard it, the faint scritch of the file on the padlock. The sound transmitted through the stone walls. They were here. Tyrrell signaled his men to ready their weapons. They listened as the gate creaked open, as the heavy marble lid was slid back, and as the thieves grunted with the effort of moving the lead coffin. The crime was happening inches away from them, separated only by a wall of granite. Swegles' voice was heard. "I'll get the wagon." The lawman watched the window. A moment later, the flare of a match pierced the darkness, the signal. "Now," Tyrrell commanded. We returned to the accidental gunshot from George Hay's pistol that echoed through the cemetery, a disastrous climax to the stakeout. Inside the catacomb, Hughes and Mullen froze. They did not know who fired, but they knew the operation was compromised. Abandoning the coffin, which was hanging halfway out of the sarcophagus, they sprinted out of the tomb. They did not head for the wagon, which didn't exist. They scattered into the woods and ravines surrounding the monument. The darkness, which had been their cover, now facilitated their escape. Tyrrell and his men charged into the catacomb, weapons raised, only to find it empty. The tools were scattered on the floor. The sarcophagus was open. The president's coffin was disrupted but safe. "They're gone!" a detective shouted. The lawmen fired a few futile shots into the darkness, but the thieves had vanished. Swegles emerged from the shadows, explaining that the shot had spooked them instantly. The trap had failed to capture them in the act, but the body was secure. Hughes and Mullen managed to make their way back to Chicago, believing they had simply been scared off by a random event or a watchman. They did not suspect Swegles. They resumed their lives at the hub, likely soothing their nerves with the establishment's supply. 10 days later, on November 17th, Tyrrell walked into the hub. He found Hughes and Mullen at the bar. The arrest was swift. The look of betrayal when they realized Swegles was the informant was reportedly absolute. The trial, held in May 1877, exposed a gaping hole in the legal system. In Illinois, as in many states, there was no specific statute felony for grave robbing. A human body was not considered property under common law, so it could not be stolen in the legal sense. The prosecution had to improvise. They charged Hughes and Mullen with conspiracy to steal the coffin, valued at $75, property of the Monument Association. Malicious mischief for damaging the marble sarcophagus. The defense argued entrapment, blaming Swegles, but the jury convicted them. However, due to the limitations of the law, the judge could only impose the maximum sentence for these misdemeanors: 1 year in the county jail. The men who tried to steal Lincoln served a mere 12 months for a crime that shocked the world. While the public believed the threat was over, John Carroll Power was paralyzed by fear. He realized how close the thieves had come. He no longer trusted the sarcophagus or the gates. In the days following the attempt, Power and a few trusted members of the Monument Association made a secret decision. On November 13, 1876, they entered the tomb, removed the coffin from the sarcophagus, and carried it into the labyrinth, the dark, confusing basement area between the walls of the foundation. The basement was damp and prone to flooding. They could not dig a grave in the mud. In a desperate improvisation, they placed the coffin of the president on a stack of wood and covered it with a pile of old lumber, debris, and discarded shingles. For 2 years, Abraham Lincoln's body lay hidden under a woodpile in a wet basement. Meanwhile, thousands of tourists paid their respects to the empty marble sarcophagus upstairs, unaware of the deception. To maintain this secret, Power organized the Lincoln Guard of Honor in 1880. This secret society of 9 men took an oath to protect the body with their lives. They were the only ones who knew the true location of the remains. Over the next decade, they moved the body several times within the tomb to protect it from moisture and potential threats. When Mary Todd Lincoln died in 1882, the Guard secretly moved her coffin into the basement as well, burying her alongside her husband in the labyrinth to prevent them from being separated. The saga finally ended in 1901. Robert Todd Lincoln, determined to ensure his father's eternal rest, ordered the total reconstruction of the tomb. He demanded a security measure that could not be breached. The coffin was to be placed in a steel cage, lowered 10 feet into the ground, and encased in tons of wet concrete. On September 26, 1901, before the concrete was poured, the surviving members of the Guard of Honor opened the coffin one last time to verify the identity. A pungent odor arose, but the features of the president were perfectly preserved. His face was recognizable. His beard was intact. Satisfied, they sealed the coffin. The concrete was poured. The cage was set. The plot of 1876 had failed, but it had fundamentally changed the death of Lincoln, turning his rest into a 25-year odyssey of secrecy and shadow. The Great Emancipator was finally, truly secure.